The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Little bit of evidence, but massive quantities of evidence show that the world is 4.5 billion years old. It's absolutely open and shut case. Look at the science. You can't deny it if you would only look at the science. Faith means belief in something without evidence. Because if you believe something without evidence, then that justifies anything. You're no longer vulnerable to somebody coming back at you and saying, hang on a minute, let me argue the case. If you believe it without evidence, which is what faith is, then you don't argue the case. You say, no, I'm not arguing that case. This is my faith. It's mine. It's private. I don't dissent from it. I don't retreat from it. You're just going to have to accept it. Now, that is evil.
And yet you spend so much of your time debating people of faith. So clearly people of faith are interested in having discussions. They're not just all blind believers, insisting on their way of...
Well, nobody said anything about all of them. I mean, the vast majority of religious people are perfectly good, nice people, as you are. There's no suggestion I've ever made that all religious people are evil. Of course not. There is a logical progression that goes from believing in faith, having faith that your God tells you to do something, and doing terrible deeds, like suicide bombing, like flying planes into skyscrapers. The vast majority of people of faith don't do such terrible things. But those people who do terrible things do it believing that they are righteous and good, and they think that they're doing the will of their God. So they're not evil people, they're actually good people by their own lights. They believe they're doing good things, and that's why religion is evil, because it can make you do evil things believing that they are good.
Do you think there could be one sentence that could convince, let's say, a creationist to seriously doubt their theory? Ideally, if you could convince a believer in God to really doubt their belief, but that's too hard.
Not sure about a sentence. I think perhaps the single most convincing fact, the observation that you could point to would be the pattern of resemblances that you see when you compare the genes using modern DNA techniques, actually looking at the letter-to-letter correspondences between genes. Compare the genes of any pair of animals you like, pair of animals, pair of plants, and then plot out the resemblances, and they fall on a perfect hierarchy, a perfect family tree. And the only alternative to it being a family tree is that the intelligent designer deliberately set out to deceive us in the most underhand and devious manner. Moreover, the same thing works with every gene you do separately, and even pseudogenes that don't do anything but are vestigial relics of genes that once did something. I find it extremely hard to imagine how any creationist who actually bothered to listen to that could possibly doubt the fact of evolution. But they don't listen. I mean, your question is a perfectly good question, but it's not really relevant, because what they do is simply stick their fingers in their ear and say la la la. They know what's true because it's in the Holy Book. And that even, I mean, the most extreme case is the geologist Kurt Wise, who has a PhD in geology from Harvard, and said, if all the evidence in the universe pointed towards an old Earth, I would be the first to admit it, but I would still be a young Earth creationist, because that is what Holy Scripture teaches me. You cannot argue with a mind like that. A mind like that, it seems to me, is, well, a disgrace to the human species.
If you actually read the Old Testament, the picture of God isn't loving. It's violent and extreme. In 1 Samuel 15, God orders the complete destruction of an entire people, men, women, children, even infants. That's not a gray area. That's genocide. In Exodus, God kills every firstborn child in Egypt, not soldiers, children. In 2 Kings 2, a prophet calls down a curse and bears tear apart dozens of kids for mocking him. And in Leviticus, people are put to death for things like working on the Sabbath. This isn't a moral framework most people would accept today. These are brutal, disproportionate punishments carried out in the name of a divine authority. If this is the source of morality, it raises a serious question about what kind of morality we're defending.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. I think that to ground your morality certainly in the Bible, would be an appalling thing to do. If you actually look at the Bible, actually look at any of the moral, almost any of the moral lessons you can take from it. And some of the things Jesus said are very nice, but you have to pick and choose your way through. And setting aside Jesus's emphasis on loving your neighbor, which is very nice. The Sermon on the Mount is very nice. The fundamental doctrine of the Old Testament, of course, is appalling. But even,
putting the Old Testament aside, in the New Testament,
even the New Testament, the idea that we're born in sin is a hideous idea. The idea that the only way to be saved from sin and the wages of sin is Jesus' death is a hideous idea. And I don't think it's one that Jesus himself ever put forward, is it? I think he probably would be rather shocked at that thought.
Well, I imagine that Jesus would have to be aware of himself as the salvation. And if that's the case, he'll need to be aware of what he's saving people from, which can only be something like slavery to sin. Now,
I wonder whether you're reading something in there. I mean, salvation, he said things like, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father. He said that kind of thing. But did he actually say that he was salvation?
Well, I suppose I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah, but
no one comes unto the Father except through me. I am
a guide for a good life, something like that. It doesn't mean that he surely never said that my death is necessary in order for you to be saved from sin.
Quite possibly. I think about the idea of the Eucharist and the Last Supper and literally breaking up my body for you. It does seem to be some indication that Jesus knew what he was doing if the Christians are correct about his mission on earth. A moment ago you said it's an appalling idea that we're all born in sin. And I understand this intuition, but do you not think there's some wisdom in this idea or some sort of necessary humility in recognizing that we all do seem to fall short of the standards that we set for ourselves? That is, we're not going to make sense of a concept like sin because we don't believe in God. We're atheists. Sin doesn't make sense. But even just in terms of our own moral standards, whatever standards we set for ourselves, we seem to fall short of these every single day. And is it not just that idea that's being captured when somebody says, look, even by your own standards, you're falling short of where you should be? And maybe that's what...
Even a newborn baby
we should
born
take
in sin?
Well, I would probably respond by saying that not all Christians will say that a newborn baby is born in sin in the sense that they're responsible for it. More like born with a propensity towards sinning, which I imagine you would even agree with, that newborn babies, although they haven't, committed immoral acts yet, they're born with this sort of human nature which has a predisposition towards doing things that fall short of our moral standards. Maybe.
I'm sorry for you having to do a degree in this kind of thing.
Even when you move into the New Testament, the problem doesn't go away. It just changes form. The core idea introduced later by Paul the Apostle is that every human is born guilty because of Adam and Eve, figures with no scientific or historical evidence. In Romans 5:12, sin enters the world through one man. So you're born flawed, and the only solution is Jesus being tortured and killed. That's the system. Guilt at birth, punishment through sacrifice. It follows the same pattern as the Old Testament, violence used to justify control.
It's not a real subject, is it?
We talked about this before on our previous podcast, and I think it's something that you wanted to ask me about today, isn't it? I mean,
well, yes. It's obviously something that still interests you.
Certainly.
Talking about, sin and things like that. I cannot imagine spending 3 years. How did you stand it?
I'll answer it in two ways. The first is to say that the theology faculty was actually theology and religion. So I was able to study religion as anthropology, religion as history. You can do papers in science and religion, this kind of stuff. And I imagine you'd be very interested in that kind of thing. Theology itself I found useful for a few reasons. One of them, of course, there's like a crude sense in which by studying theology, it helps me to debate it. It helps me to argue with people.
But I get that, definitely.
But it's also an interesting window into human psychology. For example, clearly the question does interest you. Why is it that people can believe so strongly and so easily in this idea that everybody's born in sin?
Yes,
isn't that
interesting.
Evil? Isn't that horrible?
That's a psychological question. And if you, I don't know what sort of essays you had to write, but if you were allowed to write an essay on that, that would have been interesting. If you were allowed to ask a question, how can anyone believe this stuff? But I imagine you had to actually write a serious essay on the concept of sin itself and the idea of redemption and the idea of atonement.
Well, suppose you wanted to write that essay, which you just said was an interesting question. Why would anybody believe this? Well, in order to answer that, you have to get to grips with the reasons people have for believing it.
Yes.
And I suppose that's what I'm doing here with you in saying, because you bring up the point when you look at the New Testament, you bring up this exegesis, this interpretation. This is an evil text because it tells people that they're born in sin. And I suppose the question implicitly in what you're saying there is, how can you believe this? And I'm doing that devil's advocate thing again of trying to, I suppose, explain why it is that somebody might believe this and say that even an atheist might recognize that there's a sense in which that's at least poetically true. We're all born in a state where we are unable to fulfill the standard that we want to fulfill. You know what I mean?
Poetically, yes. I suppose you could see it at a poetic level. Interestingly, I don't know whether I've told you this before, but when The Selfish Gene was published, both the chaplains of my college came up to me and said they'd read it and they thought it had echoes of Original Sin, and it was a poetic resonance with Original Sin, and I suppose that's quite interesting.
Why would The Selfish Gene have a resonance with Original Sin?
They were thinking of it in terms of the selfish gene having a sort of primitive rationale for selfishness. So that's not what the book was really intended to be about, but that's how they interpreted it. And so that resonated with their idea of Original Sin.
And what do you make of the criticism in the opposite direction? Somebody says, I've spent my life studying Thomistic metaphysics. I'm a classical theologian. I've got a PhD, and I looked in The God Delusion, and I wanted to see what Richard Dawkins had to say about Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs for the existence, his 5 ways to establish the existence of God. And they find 2 pages, and this sort of pinnacle of religious philosophy, as they see it, has a treatment in 2 pages.
Yes.
And when they question you and say, well, what about all of the important theological nuances, you respond to them, well, why would I do theology? Theology is uninteresting.
I think I would say to that, why privilege Christian theology when there are thousands of gods all around the world? They all have their own theology, and these Thomist theologians are equally ignorant of Aboriginal theology and Bantu theology and Papua New Guinea theology.
That's true.
And they think that their theology is somehow high-flown and intellectually important, but it has no greater status than any of those. The thing about science is that it's universal. It is not local. It's not tied to any particular tribe or group of people or time in history. It's what you discover in science is universal and timeless.
I think that's fair enough. But then I also think that if one of these Thomistic metaphysicians wrote a book called The Aborigine Delusion, or they tried to sort of write a chapter where they said, I'm going to debunk this idea, and then they spent 2 pages on it.
The delusion that I'm interested in is the very existence of a supernatural creator. It's not particularly
Christianity.
Insofar as I talked about Christianity, that's because I'm brought up in a Christian culture. But what really interests me is the existence of a divine creator at all.
And I suppose you're allowed to say that in a different way, and where you say, well, I'm talking about Christianity because I was brought up in that culture. And people will say, fair enough, that's what you chose to write in. Whereas a Christian, if they say, well, I focus on Christianity because I was brought up in a Christian culture, that seems to slightly undermine their position.
I mean, but if they use that as a reason for why they believe, that's a very different thing than my using it as a reason why I chose to talk about it as an example.
Quite right.
It goes further than that. The New Testament introduces eternal punishment as the consequence. In Matthew 25:46, it describes eternal punishment for those who don't follow. That means finite actions in a short human life lead to infinite suffering. That raises a serious issue. How is that just? No modern legal system would accept endless punishment for temporary mistakes. Even in John 14:6, the claim is exclusive. No one comes to God except through Jesus. So belief becomes the dividing line, not behavior or character.
Why tie it to the book of Genesis?
All right. When I first read the Bible, the things that attracted me or impressed me was the prophetic value of Scripture. As a man, I wasn't as emotionally involved as, say, my wife would have been, because at that stage I wasn't sort of in love with Jesus. So I needed more sort of facts, if you like. And historically, I know you probably could argue the points about this, but there were prophecies in the Bible that actually were fulfilled.
Like what?
Well, just talking about the birth, for example, of Jesus, in the book of Micah, which is written apparently 500 years before Christ came, explaining that he'd be born in Ephratah, Bethlehem. And even Herod, who was definitely not a believer, asked his wise men to find out where it was and how it was and when it would be that this Messiah would come, because Herod actually...
But surely you know that the Gospels were written in the way they were in order to fulfill those Old Testament prophecies.
No, I know you would say that, Richard,
Well,
but I
that's
don't
what
believe
New Testament
it.
scholars say.
I like you
but
to
in
say,
any
I'm not
case, it's
impressed
nothing to
with
do
that.
with Genesis. I mean, you're talking about Micah now. Genesis...
Well, I could mention loads of... What about the Babylonian exile, Jeremiah, the prophet?
Look, that's not relevant to the book of Genesis, where you say, on the strength of the book of Genesis, you believe that the world is, what, only 6,000 years old, something like
Yes.
that? Yeah, okay. Now, that, as you know, flies in the face of all the scientific evidence. It flies in the face of all the bishops, all the archbishops, the cardinals, Pope.
Not
Why
all
would
of them,
you...
but some, yes.
Well, most of them.
Yeah.
Why would you put your money on the book of Genesis, nothing to do with Jeremiah, nothing to do with Micah, it's the book of Genesis. Why would you put your money on that when all the scientific evidence shows, and I mean not a little bit of evidence, but massive quantities of evidence show that the world is 4.5 billion years old? I mean, it's absolutely open and shut case. Look at the science. You can't deny it if you would only look at the science.
Okay, well, you asked me the question, why would I put my faith in Genesis? It is a difficult book, given that there is so much so-called evidence to the contrary, that, or what scientists are talking about as that, you know, the Earth is millions of years old, etc. But Jesus, and I do believe 100% that Jesus did walk this earth and did the things that he did, because there are more manuscripts written about the accounts of the
yes,
gospel.
But we're not talking Jesus, we're talking Genesis now.
Well,
so.
well, let me get there, Richard, please. Is that Jesus referred to Genesis, okay? And in there, he's not a liar, and he's a man or a being that I would trust. And he spoke about, in the beginning, was Adam and Eve, for example. And he also talks about, in Colossians that Jesus is the one who created all things. Okay? So if Jesus is the one that I accept, then why should I deny the Genesis account? Because otherwise I'm saying Jesus is a liar.
Well, if you're tying Jesus to a belief that the world is only 6,000 years old, you're not doing Jesus any favors, because what you're in effect saying is that Jesus was anti-scientific, and I don't think Jesus would be very pleased about that. No doubt he was ignorant of science because he lived at a time when science was not developed. But if I were you, I would not tie Jesus, whom you love.
Jesus was not ignorant.
Well,
if you look at, and I was reading again this morning, some of the wisdom that he had, we could do with today for sure.
Well, I believe that may be true, but nevertheless, if I were you and you loved Jesus, I would not tie Jesus to the belief that the world is only 6,000 years old, because you're tying Jesus to an error, and you wouldn't wish to do that.
The evidence backs this up. The Gospels, like Matthew, were written after the events they describe and show clear signs of being shaped to match earlier texts such as Micah. That's consistent with literary construction, not independent prophecy. And on Genesis, the scientific consensus is overwhelming. Radiometric dating, fossil records, and cosmic background radiation all point to an Earth about 4.5 billion years old. That directly conflicts with a literal reading of Genesis. So the data aligns with the critique. These claims don't hold up under historical or scientific scrutiny. So when you look at all of this, the violence, the contradictions, and the lack of evidence, what do you think? Does religion give us morality, or has humanity outgrown it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your perspective. And if you found this helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.